before I start, for those of you who don't know me, I'm an internist, MD, endocrinologist, neuroendocrinologist, and I just renewed my license in Florida and New York and got recertified in my internal medicine and endocrine metabolism degrees so I could keep up with what's going on in the literature. So just for personal reasons, I have been now for 35 years exploring what I want to call fundamental reality. And I myself have gone through a lot of shifts in my personal identity, which can be very frightening at times. In spiritual traditions, they call it the dark night of the soul. And it happens inevitably when you realize that everything you thought you were, you are not. So with that, let me start with the first slide. And this is where I want to go as we pursue the mystery of our own existence. Background: I started to practice medicine in Boston in the 1970s, and I happened to be in the Department of Endocrinology at Tufts with Seymour Reichlen, who was then the president of the Endocrine Society. And at that time, Candace Pert was also a fellow with Dr. Solomon at Georgetown, and Solomon Schneider, as his name was. And she one day used the expression molecules of emotion to describe what we were looking at those days. Serotonin, opiates, dopamine, oxytocin, etc., anandamide. And it was becoming obvious to me that Candace was on something really important: molecules of emotion. So at that time also, I was, of course, we know that these molecules, neuropeptides, are now in every part of our body. And even the word neuropeptide may not be appropriate because they're everywhere. And they're also immunomodulators and have many other functions, including how our emotions are mediated into biological responses. But at the same time, during that period, I was kind of an apprentice to a guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and he's the one who brought transcendental meditation to the world. And one day he asked me, "What are you doing? What is your research?" And I said, "It's called molecules of emotion, and these are the molecules that we're looking at." And he winked at me and he said, "They're not real." And that kind of started a journey that I'm still on. What is reality? So right now, if we ask what is reality, we obviously look at ourselves, our body. If I asked you, what are you experiencing right now? You would be saying, I'm experiencing my body. I'm experiencing this world of objects in the theater of space-time and causality. And it's very real. And yet, of course, all of you here are familiar with the expressions from great philosophers, including Wittgenstein, who said, we are asleep, our life is a dream, but once in a while we wake up enough to know that we're dreaming. So what do we wake up to? And of course, you are all familiar with the Buddha's famous quote, "This lifetime of ours is transient as autumn clouds. To watch the birth and death of beings is like looking at the movements of a dance. A lifetime is like a flash of lightning in the sky, rushing by like a torrent down a steep mountain." And so this is not a new idea. It's been there for a long time. Yes, thank you, Jeffrey Martin, for bringing the slides on. Very grateful to you. So, of course, you also know that the Buddha's last words before he passed on, when Ananda asked him, "Who are you?" before he passed on. "Are you a messenger, God, Messiah, whatever?" He kept saying no. And finally, when Ananda got a little desperate, said, "Tell me who you are." The Buddha said, "I'm awake." So this is what I want to share with you. What does it mean to wake up, and to what do we wake up, and what are the confusing elements of our existence? And I'll just start by another quote from the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore. He said that I exist is a perpetual surprise. I thought that was a beautiful quote. And, you know, I walk around New York City. I just came back from lunch, and I see people all over the place, and I don't think they're wondering about the mystery of existence, which is such a tragedy, because once you get bamboozled and surprised by existence, there's no going back. Your life is filled with curiosity and wonder, and ultimately delight. So let's see the next slide. Jeffrey, may I have the next slide? These days, a lot of meditation teachers are talking about the direct method and direct experience. So basically, if we were to summarize what the direct experience of anything is, it could be this acronym, SIFT, S-I-F-T, sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. I don't think there's any experience outside this. By sensations, of course, we also mean sense perceptions, sound, noise, colors, shapes, fragrances, and odors, and tastes, and all different kinds of sensations, and also images and feelings and thoughts, all subtle sensations on the screen of consciousness. And so when we give meaning to this direct experience, we generate perceptions. There's first fundamental experience in the form of the five senses: sound, touch, sight, taste, smell. And once meaning is given to them, then a perception is created. That's how I interpret it. And, you know, when I was in medical school, a Nobel Prize was given to these visual scientists who took cats or kittens and brought them up in a room that had only horizontal stripes. And they took another group of kittens, brought them up in a room that had vertical stripes. And when these kittens grew up, one group of kittens could see only a horizontal world, and the other group of kittens could only see a vertical world. And their brain networks were such that their neural connections only allowed them to see either a visual experience of horizontality or verticality. One group of cats, for example, could not see furniture legs. This was the first clue to me as a medical student that perception is a learned phenomenon, and that we learn to perceive, and that our experiences as children ultimately, and how we interpret them, shape all of what we call reality, including our experience of mind and body and what we call the universe. Direct visual experience is just color, shape, and form. Without color, there's no shape, and without shape, there's no form. When we give meaning to it, then it appears as objects out there. But actually, it's a perceptual activity in consciousness, which is modifying itself into color, shape, and form. As you know, photons are not, don't have color, and no neural correlate in the brain has color, and yet we experience color. And color, shape, and form create the objective experience of what we call physical objects, or what we label as physical objects. Similarly, direct auditory experience is noise or sound. Given meaning, it can become poetry, music, anything else that we want, including this conversation. A tactile experience, just sensation; gustatory experience, just flavor and taste; and olfactory experience, just odor and fragrance. Let me see the next slide. And here what you will see is what I've just said. All perception is a learned phenomenon, and perception occurs when we give meaning to direct sensory experience. And this is something that humans do more than any other species, I believe. When you look at deep history, you see that up until 30, 40,000 years ago, there were several types of humans. We are Homo sapiens, means the wise ones. We gave ourselves that name, humble enough to give ourselves that name, but then we gave names to other species of humans, Neanderthals and Floroenses, etc. And all these hominid forms had a rudimentary language like other animals have, mating, food, and danger. But then we created a language for narrative, for storytelling, and basically took over the world. Because as soon as we became storytellers, we created constructs like money and nation states and empires. And ultimately, everything that we take for granted as reality is actually a human construct today. Latitude, longitude, nation states, Wall Street, money, all human creations based on perceptions, human perceptions, which occupy a very narrow bandwidth of the electromagnetic spectrum. So when you look at me or look at an object, any object, now science tells us that if you could see it as it really is, you would see it's proportionately as void as intergalactic space, and everything that you see as an object actually is mostly empty space. You would see a few scattered dots and spots and some random electrical discharges, and even those are manifestations of empty space. Next slide, please. I would like to share with you how that then creates a whole cascade of what we call everyday reality. We give meaning to sensations, we create perceptions, and then how we interpret those perceptions creates emotions and thoughts. And basically, our life becomes a storyline created by emotions and thoughts. And this is the creation of everyday reality that we call mind, body, and the world. If you say, I have a body, then which one? And you started as a fertilized egg, then you became a zygote, an embryo, a baby, a toddler, and an adult, and if you're lucky, all the way to dusty death. So what we call the physical body is something we experience in our consciousness as our own perceptual activity, which is constantly changing. And every perception is like a snapshot. But when we string these snapshots together and give it a story, then suddenly we have mind, body, and world. Next slide, please. So mind, body, and world are human constructs and ultimately illusions. Everything you can see, touch, sight, taste, smell, hear, imagine, conceptualize is not real. This is what the Vedanta says. If you can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, conceptualize it, and then it is not real. And recently I was also reading a science paper which said that everything you experience is illusion created by the brain, but then the brain itself is a perceptual activity in consciousness. So the brain itself could be the biggest illusion that human beings experience. Next slide, please. So illusions are mistaken for reality until you understand the trick behind the illusions. And we as body mind are also embedded in these illusions. And the great Vedantic tradition says that these are magical eyes. The word used for that is Maya, and the play of Maya is Leela, the play of the universe, in an infinite, unbounded, borderless, irreducible, fundamental, without cause domain of experience or source of experience that we call awareness or consciousness. Next slide, please. So once we see the trick behind the web of magical lies and illusions, we are free to create the reality, personal and collective, that we want. We now consciously create. What we create, we think is the real reality, but it's a perceptual experience interpreted in human consciousness, which we call the mind. So next slide, please. Freedom to create everyday reality consciously is the means to alleviate suffering, a means to understand what freedom from the fear of death means, and also knowing ourselves as timeless beings, which automatically results in the emergence of Platonic values or higher values such as truth, beauty, love, compassion, joy, bliss, creativity. So as a student of comparative religion, I was also looking at what we call the essential religious experience in every tradition, from Islam to Buddhism to Sufi Islam to the teachings of the Zen masters to many of the prophets of the Old Testament, etc. And one of the things that we see in every tradition is that there's a commonality to the so-called religious or spiritual experience. One is finding your identity beyond space-time, finding yourself as a non-local being that exists outside of space-time, because space-time are also an experience in the same fundamental reality. The second is the emergence of these Platonic values, higher values, truth, beauty, goodness, compassion, joy, bliss, insight, creativity. In Sanskrit, Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. And the third is the loss of the fear of death, because that aspect of you that we call awareness is not subject to birth or death. So those are three common experiences in every religion: knowing your true self beyond your conditioned, divided mind, Platonic truth, and loss of the fear of death. So let's see the next slide. And I just want to share with you that these days we're talking about quantum entanglement, but actually everything that we call experience is entangled. There's quantum entanglement, which is non-local correlation. There is qualia entanglement, which is the entanglement of experience, qualities of experience. And then there's meaning entanglement, and then the metabolism of experience that we call mind, body, and universe. And if you understand this process, then we can also actually understand not only how do we create the projective reality that we call body, mind, and universe, but now with current physics exploring multiverses and this new talk on the metaverses, this takes on amazing implications for the future of human consciousness, also for the future of the evolution of the universe, which evolves in consciousness. So next slide, please. All perception experience is conceived, constructed, governed, and comes into existence in awareness. As I mentioned before we see anything, photons are invisible and have no brightness. Auditory experience is noise, but then it becomes stories and facts and music and poetry. Tactile experience is just qualia: hardness, softness, roughness, smoothness, texture. But then we say this is a solid object, but solid to whom? A human being. How solid would this be to a crocodile? And what would this appear as to say, a bat that navigates through the echo of ultrasound, or a snake that navigates through infrared? What is this anyway? And the great wisdom traditions of the East would say, this is a modulation of awareness, of qualities of awareness. In fact, if you study Kashmiri Shaivism and Vedanta, they say you and the universe are awareness. And when you first hear this, you say, what the heck? Is my iPhone made of awareness? Is the Empire State Building made of awareness? Is my body made of awareness? Is the Milky Way galaxy made of awareness? And the answer is yes. The only way you know these things is through modulations of awareness that ultimately appear as perceptual activity in consciousness, and that is also interpreted as thoughts and feelings and emotions and the whole gamut of experience that we call SIFT, SIFT. Next slide, please. So matter in the physical world then are convenient fictions. Going back to the Vedanta, it is not what you see, but what is it that is seeing? Is it not what you know, but what is it that knows? And what we call physical reality, including our physical body, is a construct in human awareness using a very narrow bandwidth of vibrations or fluctuations of consciousness. And that perceptual activity is specific to every species and also differs frequently in different cultures. And shared experiences, the overlapping of bandwidths with animals and other people, and each of our experiences might be totally unique, but there are leaky margins and constructs that we all agree to, including actually leaky margins with the experiences of your pets and dogs and cats as well. Next slide, please. So just a few illustrations that you might be familiar with. If you look carefully here, you can see either a skull or a woman sitting at a drawer, wearing makeup, looking into a mirror. But the raw experience here is just shape, color, and form. As soon as we give meaning from a previous experience to it, it becomes a perception. And that then leads to whether we are enjoying this perception, emotions, feelings, thoughts, imagination, and creativity, just through the raw experience, in this case, of colors, shapes, and forms. Next slide, please. Again, are you seeing two faces? Are you seeing a jar or a goblet? Next slide. It depends on what meaning you give to those colors. A man playing a bugle or a woman's face. Next slide. Here you can see three different beings, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, and father-in-law, all at the same time. But in fact, it's just a bunch of colors that consciousness is modifying itself into that experience of knowing itself as color, shape, form, then giving it meaning and creating a perception, and then that perception generating emotions, etc. Next slide, please. Here are some very interesting that you might enjoy. So here you can see an old man, Mexican, riding a horse. Next slide. Similarly, a butterfly landing on a flower, woman's face, all constructed in consciousness. Consciousness is conceiving, constructing, governing, and creating this experience and embedding itself into the experience as well. Next slide, please. Again, there's some birds alighting on a tree or a woman's face. Up to you to decide what it is, this particular perception. Next slide. A horse, two horses against a background of sky and mountain, or a woman's face with long locks. Next slide. I think we've made the point. Here also, you can see two separate perceptions depending on how you interpret the colors and shapes and forms that you're seeing. Next slide. I like this because it reminds me from a poem from William Blake, who says, "We are led to believe a lie when we see with and not through the eye that was born in a night to perish in a night while the soul slept in beams of light." Next slide, please. And here you'll see a face that actually doesn't exist. You'll see animals that don't exist. And my final slide here in this series is this favorite one. The face that appears is not in the picture. In fact, even the animals and the tree that occur are not in the picture. They're all shapes, colors, and forms given meaning by human consciousness based on our conditioning and memory of the past. In other words, everything you see, you're actually reconstructing, imagining, and that includes your physical body. Next slide, please. So, what is the point of all this? The point of all this is that the great yogic tradition actually did not have this subject-object split at all that we talk about in scientific realism, or what we call naive realism. Scientific realism and naive realism, which is responsible for all our technology, but not for understanding fundamental reality. So naive realism posits that the physical world is exactly as it appears to the five human senses. And even if human beings disappeared, the physical universe would exist as it appears to our five human senses. Of course, this discounts the experience of other species altogether. Only human experience is valid and creates what we call the objective world. And then, of course, naive realism also is based on subject-object split, which is artificial. And yet it's so successful in creating our technologies. And the reason I think this is so is that we only extend through VR and augmented reality what is already a VR experience. Our body, mind, and universe are a VR experience, a virtual reality, augmented reality, consciousness turning within itself and modifying itself into sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, and then the rest is spontaneous appearance of the human universe. And then constructs, force fields, atoms, particles, bosons, the whole thing. We think those are real, but those are human constructs also for modes of knowing and experience in human consciousness. Before you can call something an atom or a molecule or a Higgs boson, it's an observation, it's an experience, it's a perception. And then we reify that experience in consciousness and manifest the objective world, which includes our own physical bodies. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, I wrote a book called Metahuman about this topic. How do we wake up? As you know, meta means beyond. I looked up the word. I thought, I was using it myself uniquely, but actually metahuman was used by Abraham Maslow in his writings. Meta means beyond, and so meta means beyond the ordinary human conditioned divided mind. So as we explore this waking up, there are certain states that we are guided by the great wisdom traditions, especially Vedanta, yoga, and all the 8 limbs of yoga. And these are some of the steps I've used as my own process to go beyond the illusions of the conditioned mind. And the first step is non-reactivity, overriding the automatic brain-mind response. I use this formula: stop, S-T-O-P, stop, pause before reacting, take 3 deep breaths, observe your mind getting quiet and calmer, and then proceed with awareness. And then slowly develop what the Buddhism calls the divine attitudes of interbeingness, interconnectedness, like compassion and gratitude and kindness and joy and bliss and equanimity, a non-judgmental acceptance of yourself and others. Interoception, this I became very fascinated by the process of interoception, because in yoga it's called pratyahara, and pratyahara is getting to know the internal world. Just as we get to know the external world through perception, we can quieten the mind and bring awareness to different parts of the body, and actually learn to even not only experience every organ in the body, but modulate its activity through techniques that include dharana, which is focused awareness, dhyan, which is meditation, and samadhi, which is transcendence. And ultimately, this leads to a process called metacognition, being a witness to what we call inner and outer reality, but there's no inner outer. It's just awareness generating qualia, some interpreted as the inner world and some interpreted as the outer world. Krishnamurti said this more beautifully than I can say. He said, the highest intelligence is the ability to observe yourself without judging yourself. And in that comes clarity. Next slide, please. So in my tradition, the Vedanta and Kashmir Shaivism and aspects of Buddhism, reality is different in different states of consciousness. The most obvious state of reality is what we call the waking state, which the Vedanta calls the waking dream. What you call the world of space-time in causality is actually a lucid dream in a vivid now. But then as we start to imagine and remember, we create the experience of time as well, although all we're experiencing at this moment is flashpoints of perception. These are projections of consciousness appearing as the theater of space-time and causality. I was also looking up, by the way, the evolution of sleep in different species, and it seems that life evolved from deep sleep into dreams and then ultimately waking state as the projected dream state. But then the Vedanta goes beyond that. It has said there's a fourth state of consciousness called Turiya. Turiya is becoming aware of the witness. So right now, as you're listening to me, if you would just be aware of that which is listening, you would have a glimpse of the observer, a glimpse, or not, I would say, an awareness of the observer. And that's called Turiya, transcendental consciousness. And if we abide in that, and then that becomes the state of witnessing awareness, becomes permanent in waking, dreaming, and sleeping. That's called cosmic consciousness, or local and non-local consciousness at the same time. And then the same witnessing awareness becomes apparent in the objects of perception. That's called divine consciousness. And suddenly the whole world of synchronicity and self-regulation and self-organization and self-evolution and non-local correlation and unpredictability and infinite creativity opens up in this state of divine consciousness. And ultimately, even that awakens to what is called freedom or moksha, where you recognize that you are the ground of existence and the whole universe is arising and subsiding in your own being as timeless now. Yes, somebody just said Ashtavakra Gita. This is exactly what happens. And as we evolve in these states of consciousness, everything changes. The brain changes, perception changes, emotions change, relationships change, creativity enhances. There's more comfort with unpredictability, and synchronicity becomes a real experience. So let's see what this could mean. Next slide, please. So meta-reality then is the awareness which is prior to conditioning, referred to as pure consciousness, field of infinite possibilities, formless, without cause, irreducible, infinite, fundamental, and therefore infinitely creative, unfolding through synchronicity or non-local correlation. I recently heard a quantum physicist use the expression non-local, acausal, quantum mechanical interrelatedness. This field is also the source of our intentions and attention. Prior to conditioning, it's not modified, and it is rooted in the knowing I am. Not I'm Deepak Chopra or an Alan Combs or I am this or that, but just I am before I'm anything else. Next slide. So with this, I decided to join this movement right now that is being called the Metaverse. There's a lot of talk about this. And even though I had used the word metahuman many years ago, Abraham Maslow, of course, used it originally in meta-reality. Right now on social media, I find I'm being attacked for working for Mark Zuckerberg because he changed the name of Facebook to Meta. Such is the joke on social media. So next slide, please. What happens when we start to wake up? There's a shift in sense of self. And Jeffrey Martin will recognize some of these things from his own work. And, we've been publishing material on this as well. But a lot of this has to do with the experiences of people who are involved in meditative techniques and advanced interoception and also witnessing awareness. There's a sense of shift in the sense of self from me to something that is non-local. Change in emotions from fear and separation to love and unity and empathy and compassion and joy and equanimity. Shifts in cognition and perception. Cognition means the mind becomes quieter. Perception is in the present moment. A shift in memory, the Vedantists say, I use memories, but I don't allow memories to use me. A greater degree of insight, which is actually vipassana, which is the origin of all this mindfulness movement, vision for possibilities, creativity, flow, transcendence, joy, ecstasy, and a loss of sense of personal agency from me to we to us to the infinite, and ultimately the loss of the fear of death. And I have to share with you that this is what I'm experiencing right now, with moments of doubt that occur every time you explore dimensions of reality which threaten your personal identity. So next slide, please. This is exactly what I wanted to share about, but where does the metaverse fit in right now? As you know, there is right now lots of conversation about infinite universes, string theories. If you read Sean Carroll's book, Something Deeply Hidden, and Sean Carroll is no ordinary physicist. He sits on the same desk as Richard Feynman. Einstein was a visitor there. Sean Carroll's book favors the multiverse theories, string theories, and says there are infinite universes. Right now, current cosmology suggests 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, and uncountable trillions of planets. Uncountable trillions of planets, possibly 60 billion habitable planets in just the Milky Way galaxy, based on the Goldilocks zone and whether there's a biosphere or not. So the other day I took a walk by the beach and I tried very hard to pick one grain of sand on the beach. And this was a mighty beach in San Diego. And then I reminded myself that that one grain of sand was the equivalent of planet Earth in all the beaches of the universe, all the beaches of all the planets, including ours. One grain of sand. And in this one grain of sand is a species called Homo sapiens that dares to think we can solve the mystery of existence and why there is existence. One grain of sand is planet Earth in all the beaches of the world. And here is our consciousness that navigates the cosmos. It doesn't... if this doesn't bewilder you, what will? Rumi said, exchange your cleverness for bewilderment, because bewilderment is a holy experience. While we here struggle to create maps and territories and categories of thought and science and theology and religion, there's a mystery, and it's very sacred. And I don't think it's solvable. We can keep creating maps, but one thing is for sure. When we cross the threshold of that dark night of the soul, there is only joy. There is only love. And then you understand that love is not a mere sentiment. It's the ultimate truth at the heart of creation. One awareness, infinite, modifying itself into innumerable minds, innumerable bodies, innumerable worlds experienced. Sean Carroll might be right. There are infinite universes, but they're not in space-time. The Vedanta, Yoga Vasishtha, and I'll end with this. Vasishtha is a great seer in the Indian mythologies, and his student is Ram. Ram is the incarnation of God, like Jesus, and his father, who's an emperor, sends Ram to this great seer, great Rishi Vasishtha. And as is the traditional custom in India, the student bows, touches the feet of the guru. But in this case, Vasishtha, the guru withdraws, and he says to the kid, "You're the incarnation of God. You are God. You don't need to touch my feet." And Ram says, "I might be God, but I have forgotten. So I've come to you to remind me of who I am." And in that great Vasishtha's writings, there's one beautiful image, one beautiful teaching, where Vasishtha says, infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness. They're like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light that's shining through a hole in my roof. Infinite universes. And now science is suggesting that too. But I would posit to you, these are not domains of existence, space-time, just as this is not a domain of existence in space-time. These are all frequency domains of an infinite consciousness. And infinite being infinite, it cannot be compromised. If you subtract infinity from infinity, what remains is infinity. You multiply infinity by infinity, you get infinity. Subtract infinity, the absolute sacrifices itself into infinite versions of itself. And they're all equally real or all equally unreal. But embedding yourself in this mystery is nothing other than a source of joy and love. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Sorry about the computer glitch
Jeffrey,
there.
I'm sure you saw some of your own work there.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It's always a great honor involving you, all of your massive wisdom and decades of experience. We have time for questions. So if you're game for them, I say we open up the mic and see what people want to know. What do you say?
Sure, anytime.
All right. Let's raise hands, which you can do by clicking the reactions button on your screen if you don't know where the raise hand button is. And we'll just go down the list here. So Kirk, it looks like you're up first.
Excellent. Deepak, greetings from Encinitas, California. As you've aged in clock time, how have you changed your view as you're getting closer to, you know, the ultimate exit out of our current reality?
So, you know, in the tradition I come from, and I didn't think I was a traditionalist, but I am. So there are 4 ashramas of life. Ashrama means resting place. The first 25 years is education. The second 25 years is what we call material success, fame, fortune. The third is giving back. And the fourth, which I just entered, I turned 75 last October, is self-realization and preparation for death. So while I continue to do whatever I do every day, because I have to do something, and my job right now is I sell words, I write books, and I do seminars. While I continue to do that, my practice, my daily practice of what could be called yoga in all its dimensions, you know, the social and emotional understanding of existence, but also yogasana, pranayam, dharana, dhyan, samadhi, introception, pratyahara, has very much deepened. And I do 2 hours of practice in the morning, and then from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., I sit quietly, I recapitulate my entire life. And it's fascinating that I can go back to 4 years and smell the skin of my mother, and I'm sitting on her lap and listening to her hymns. And then I also actually meditate on my personal death, the death of my ego, body, mind. And then recently, I've actually become interested in some of the research on psychedelics with colleagues here in New York, NYU, Columbia University Medical School. Gotten very interested in what is called terminal lucidity and the gamma waves that accompany that, but also the role of psychedelics in this experience of terminal lucidity, where people actually have experience of subtle forms of dead relatives and pets, and they communicate. And, you know, in the beginning, I was totally kind of befuddled by these experiences not being real, but they are real. I've now sat through people through their last moments of death, some of them who've had terminal lucidity. I personally can access these subtle domains of experience, and it's given me the conviction that everything that we experience, whether subtle or gross as physical, is actually me, the real me, knowing myself as this and everything else. And at times it's a very scary experience. In the beginning it was, but right now, by the way, it's very joyous. And I've also stopped identifying with stories, because I know that every story I tell myself is provisional, and the guy who's telling the story to itself is also provisional. So that once you realize that, actually, you become almost in love with what is called awareness or nothingness. So, you know, normally if I ask any one of you, not you, because you're a very smart bunch of people, ask people to just look around and tell me what they see. And they say, I see objects, I see this, I see a phone, I see a picture. They never say, I see myself too. They never say, I see my thoughts. They never say, I see empty space. And yet, you know, the dominant experience is when I look around, we are surrounded by infinity in every direction. And we're missing it. It's right here in front of us because our attention is taken up by objects, which are also perceptual activities of me as this object. So that experience I'm having, and it is both liberating and both at sometimes scary. But this is my life now, and there's no going back.
Thank you very much. Anil.
Yes, hi. Deeply grateful for the opportunity to be asking this question, Dr. Chopra. I'm Anil Maheshwari from Maharishi International University.
Very nice to meet you, Anil.
Same here. Very grateful for what you presented. Your 7 states of consciousness is very, very directly similar to Maharishi's. I read your book, or listened to your book rather, a year ago, and that's when I learned about the MAPI inventory that you sort of were using, non-dual things. So wonderful work. And I thought what you were describing about the reality today is like almost like the infinite Maya Jal fighting the infinite consciousness. It's a game that's kind of going on constantly. Who knows who will win? I'm personally very devoted to world peace. That's why I'm sort of at the university here after having spent a lot of time in various places, very committed, devoted. So I would ask you, you work very closely with Maharishi. I would like you to just imagine, what would Maharishi say to creating world peace and prosperity at this particular stage of world?
Well, as you saw, those 7 states of consciousness directly from the tradition of Maharishi and the great tradition of Holy Masters. And I think Maharishi was very clear that if there was a critical mass of people living in peace consciousness, that there would be peace if there was a critical mass. We used to call it the Maharishi effect. I'm sure we still call it that. And I do think that right now, if you look at the world, climate change, pandemics, mass migrations, war, terrorism, eco-destruction, extinction of species, total destruction of the microbiome, the planetary microbiome. At this moment, actually, if you look at the science, which I have, climate change is reversible. And so is 95% of illness that we call genetic is actually, if you really look at illness, less than 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant. 95% are basically lifestyle and how we use consciousness and express it in thoughts, words, speech, behavior, and relationships. So right now what we're seeing is a totally dysfunctional world. And if you look at, if you think of, the cosmic cycle in 24 hours, we are less than a minute away from mass extinction. And this is because of the divided mind right now, this fearful, divided mind. And if we want a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world, then each of us has to be that presence of ahimsa. When you look at the yamas and the niyamas, the first is ahimsa. And Patanjali says very clearly that when we are perfectly established in peace consciousness, all beings around us cease to feel hostility, not by what we say, not by what we do, but just by our presence. We need that critical mass of ahimsa, and the world will be transformed into a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world, because it all comes from the presence of fundamental peace that already exists behind the dark alleys and the ghost-filled attics of our mind. Is only peace. We've just overshadowed it through our conditioning, through thousands of years of division, and we have now become the predators on this planet. I think there's hope, but the choice is ours. Some of the words we use are so divisive anyway. Language is a very important part of our communication, and language is not considered a spiritual practice in the West. But as you know, language is Saraswati, and she's a goddess. And how we use language actually determines our perception. So even the word environment and climate change is a way an alienating word. There's me and there's the universe. When in reality, trees are our lungs. If trees didn't breathe, we wouldn't breathe. And we didn't breathe, the trees wouldn't be breathing. You put an animal in a vacuum, it dies. You put a plant in a vacuum, it dies. You put them both together, they thrive. So this air is our breath. We're trying to divide it up. My air or my air traffic, and COVID-19 has just shown us that there's no dividing up the air. The air is our breath. Waters and rivers are our circulation. The earth is recycling as our body, and the stars gave us the atoms. So why do we call that the world? That's our extended body. We have a personal body. We have a universal body, and they're both equally ours. When we use the right language, aham brahmasmi, tattvamasi, that itself changes our perception. Right now, everything we know, technology, we can reverse climate change. Who's doing it? Because they're not in love. They're not in love with their own body and their own biosphere, which is their body.
Right. In the morning, if I may just follow a comment, there was a presentation, I think, of Peter Fenwick about depth. I think we were talking a lot of this dysfunctional behavior of acquisition is going on because people are fearing death. If, he was saying if people are educated about death and don't worry, I don't think so much chaos will be going on.
Yeah, I would invite you to actually, Bob Thurman, Tibet House, is doing a whole week on death and the mystery of death, which is as big as the mystery of birth. And I would invite all of you to check out Tibet House and their offering on death that is happening right now. In fact, if you go on my social media, there's a reference to it. But ultimately, all fear is the fear of death, which is the fear of the unknown. And again, going back to Krishnamurti, he said, it's not the unknown that we should fear, it's the known that we should fear, which is that the prison of our past conditioning. The unknown right now, everything is unknown. This moment and everything follows. And if we embrace the unknown and that field of infinite possibilities, and we fall in love with the unknown, which is dimensionless, then we are free to create our own experiences in dimensionality. And that's what the ultimate metaverse will be. You know, all these lokas that the Vedic tradition talks about, but the traditions talk about lokas and bardos and infinite dimensions, it seems they're real. I mean, the more we understand theoretically the world of manifestation, consciousness being infinite can manifest infinite dimensions. There's no problem over there. You know, the Yoga Vasishta also says, just as movement is inherent in air, manifestation is inherent in consciousness.